If you got a call from the bank saying your $250,000 loan had been paid off, but you weren't the one who paid it, what's the first thing you'd think of? Fraud? A lottery win? Or some catastrophic mistake? It was a quiet Tuesday morning in Des Moines, Iowa. I had just finished gardening, my hands still covered in soil, when the phone rang. I didn't recognize the number, but something told me I should answer. Hello, Mrs. Lynn. I'm calling from Wells Fargo to confirm that your $250,000 loan at the East Grand branch was paid in full yesterday, the woman said, her voice calm, like this was an everyday thing. I froze, glancing around my kitchen like the answer might be hiding between the coffee maker and the old wall clock. I'm sorry, what did you just say? I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. She repeated it, this time including the account number, the transaction date, and a confirmation of the electronic signature. Everything matched. It wasn't a scam. It wasn't a system error. It wasn't someone mistaking me for somebody else. But I hadn't paid it. I was actually in the middle of trying to restructure that loan, since after retiring from Roosevelt High School, I'd been living off my teacher's pension and a small stash of savings. My heart pounded so loudly I could barely think. A swirl of emotions rushed in relief, confusion, anxiety, and a touch of fear. Who in the world would pay off $250,000 for me without saying a word? And why? My name is Lynn Carter. I'm 61 years old, living alone in a small wooden house on the east side of Des Moines, Iowa. It's been my peaceful haven ever since my husband David passed away from pancreatic cancer 8 years ago. I taught American literature for 35 years at Roosevelt High, the same school my son Jake once attended. My life's not fancy, but it's honest. I drive an old Subaru, grow tomatoes in the backyard, and call my sister in Minnesota every Sunday afternoon. After David passed, I was left with a $250,000 loan we had taken out to renovate the house, pay for Jake's college, and cover David's end-of-life medical care. That loan had haunted me ever since. Even after retirement, I took on a part-time job at the city library just to keep the payments on track. I never complained to anyone, especially not to my son. Jake now works as a software engineer in Denver. He always thought I was doing fine. I tried to make it seem that way whenever he visited, even if it meant hiding payment receipts under a stack of letters in my desk drawer. I didn't want him to worry. I didn't want him to feel burdened. I'm his mother, and a real mother shields her child from the storm. She doesn't ask for an umbrella. So when the bank told me the loan had been paid off, I was stunned and shaken. A massive secret had just surfaced, and I didn't know whether it was a gift or a storm on the horizon. After I hung up, the kitchen went eerily quiet, as if time had paused. I opened a drawer and pulled out a copy of the loan contract, reading it line by line, hoping to find some hidden clause that said surprise forgiveness. There wasn't one. Every number, every term was still there, except now, the debt was gone. I called my financial advisor, Richard, the same one I've trusted since David passed. He confirmed the payment had indeed come from a personal bank account in Denver, though the account holder's name was redacted for privacy. I exhaled slowly. Who else lives in Denver besides my son? A knot of conflicting feelings twisted in my chest. Why would Jake do this without telling me? Did he think I wasn't capable of handling it? Did he see me as too fragile to know the truth? Or worse, was something going on with him that I didn't know about? I started questioning everything. Was Jake in trouble? Was this guilt? Was he trying to make up for something I hadn't yet discovered? A gift that big doesn't just come from filial piety. Not in this country. Not in America, where we sweat for every dollar and pinch pennies just to retire. I thought back to Jake's recent visits. He smiled, but he seemed tired. His eyes looked hollow, and his answers were short. I had chalked it up to work stress. But now I saw a different picture. Maybe my son was carrying the weight I thought I had hidden from him. I knew I had to talk to him. But how? How do you start that conversation without sounding accusatory? How do you ask your child, why did you pay off my debt, without both of you breaking down in tears? The quiet life I had carefully preserved for years now stood on the threshold of a truth I wasn't ready to face. The truth is that $250,000 wasn't just a number on a loan contract. It was the shadow that followed me for nearly a decade. When David was alive, we shared everything: breakfasts, utility bills, and dreams of retirement. But after he was gone, all that remained was a mortgaged house, a loan with a fluctuating interest rate, and a heavy heart with no one left to lean on. I thought I was strong enough to handle it all. I got used to pinching every penny, tracking every expense, and turning down social invitations just to stay on top of the payments. I even gave up my nightly ritual of reading novels, my mind too anxious to follow the plots. I learned to fake a polite laugh at the library whenever coworkers asked, "Lynn, when are you going to retire?" not knowing I was still working just to cover interest. Financial pressure doesn't show up like a monster. It creeps in quietly at the grocery store, when the tires need replacing, when a letter from the IRS lands in the mailbox. I wasn't living, I was bracing. And I never told Jake. He's my only son, and I wanted him to have the freedom I never did. I was afraid that if he knew I was struggling, he'd give up opportunities, trade dreams for duty. Sometimes, being a mother isn't about grand sacrifices. It's about suffering silently. But now, that burden, it's gone. And I don't feel as relieved as I thought I would. I feel hollow, like someone just took away my role in my own life. Maybe it's because I've grown used to worry. Maybe it's because I'm afraid that if Jake knows, then every other truth I tried to hide is no longer a secret. Maybe I'm afraid he saw me at my weakest and quietly stepped in to do what I always believed was a mother's job. Looking back, I know I wasn't perfect. I used to believe that everything will work out was enough to get through tough times. But that kind of faith sometimes blinded me to reality. David and I weren't wealthy, but when we were younger, we lived with a very American kind of optimism. If you work hard and you're a good person, life will treat you fairly in return. So we borrowed money to fix up the house, to help our parents with medical bills, and most of all, to send Jake to a private university in Chicago. It was an expensive choice, but at the time, we believed education was a worthy investment. The problem was, we never had a plan B. We didn't have a large emergency fund. We didn't buy life insurance for David, partly to save money, and partly because no one wants to think about death at 50. And I never paid attention to investing, stocks, or anything beyond our savings account. I was also proud. After David passed, a few relatives offered to help, but I turned them down. I said, "I'll manage." I took on the burden myself, partly out of pride, partly because I thought it was the right thing to do. I never told Jake the truth about our finances. I was afraid he'd feel guilty about everything we had done for him. I kept it hidden so well that once I borrowed $2,000 from my retirement fund just to cover a loan payment and still smiled at him and said, "I'm fine. Don't worry." Maybe my biggest mistake wasn't taking on too much debt. It was believing I had to carry it all alone to be a good mother. I didn't allow myself to be vulnerable. I didn't allow myself to ask for help. And now, finding out that my son had done what I always refused, to help me, the emotions I felt weren't just gratitude. They were regret. If only I had been honest sooner. If only I had let Jake see the real me, both strong and fragile. That night, I couldn't sleep. I sat at the kitchen table, a small lamp casting a soft yellow glow across a folder of old bank documents. Outside the window, snow was falling gently on the neighbors' rooftops, blanketing the alley behind the house in white. It was a quiet night, so quiet that the ticking of the wall clock sounded like a hammer pounding in my chest. I opened old emails, digging through messages Jake had sent over the years. There was one from 2 years ago, just one line. "Mom, are you sure you're okay?" I had replied, "Absolutely. I'm still working at the library. Don't worry." I remember that moment. I cried after I hit send. And now I cried again. Not because of financial exhaustion, but because I realized I had severed a connection with the one person still left in my life. I felt like I had failed, not just as a mother, but as a woman who believed that burdens were meant to be hidden. I had pushed my son out of my world, while he silently stepped into it to help me. I nearly broke down completely when I opened an attachment in the bank email, a transfer receipt, signed Jacob Carter. There was no more doubt. Jake had paid off the loan. The boy I once cradled in my arms had become the person holding me up, without me ever realizing it. I leaned back in my chair, my chest tightening. How long had it been since I'd had an honest conversation with Jake? When was the last time I asked how he was doing? Shared my fears, my fatigue, or simply said, "Thank you for being in my life"? I realized I couldn't keep living this way. I couldn't let silence and pride stand in for connection. I couldn't keep pretending to be strong when my son had already chosen to carry the weight I was too proud to name. That night, I almost fell apart. But in that very moment, I knew I had to change. I had to face the truth. And I had to speak it, not to justify, but to heal. The next morning, I called Jake. I didn't dance around it. I asked him directly, "Did you pay off my loan?" There was a pause on the other end, then his voice calm and low. "I'm sorry, Mom. I knew you'd be upset if I told you. But I couldn't let you carry that weight forever." I didn't know what to say. In that moment, I wanted to scold him for making such a big decision without asking, but I also wanted to hold him tight and cry. Jake continued, "I saw your credit report a few months ago. You probably thought I wasn't paying attention, but I always checked when I helped you apply for a new card. I saw you were still making every payment. I knew you'd never say anything, so I did it." I was overwhelmed. Not because the $250,000 debt was gone, but because, for the first time in years, I felt seen. Understood, without having to explain. Jake, the child I once helped take his first steps, had become the person who understood me more than I understood myself. I asked him, "But where did you get that kind of money?" "I know your salary." Jake chuckled softly, then said, "In college, I worked in the research lab and quietly started learning about investing from a finance professor. After graduation, I didn't spend much. I invested consistently, stocks, retirement funds, some small real estate. You didn't know because I didn't want to brag, but I did it because of you. You were the reason I learned how to manage money. I didn't want you spending the rest of your life paying for the kind choices you made years ago." I broke down in tears. Not from shame, but because, for the first time, I understood that every sacrifice I'd made, every extra shift, every modest dinner, every time I turned down help had been noticed, and remembered, and transformed into a single, quiet act of love, setting his mother free without ever asking for anything in return. For years, I thought I had to protect my son. But it turns out he had been protecting me all along by saying nothing at all. And that was the turning point in my life. I realized that love isn't just about giving, it's also about having the courage to receive when someone offers it back in a deeper, wordless way. I sat alone on the garden bench, sunlight streaming through the leafless branches, just beginning to bud. I held a cup of tea in my hands, though I no longer cared if it was hot or cold. My mind was somewhere deeper, somewhere I had never let myself go before. For so many years, I believed that being a mother meant carrying the weight of the world. Being the silent sacrificer. The one who kept everything in order and stable, so her child could live his own life in peace. But now I see it clearly, I had locked myself into an outdated mold. I had confused strength with isolation. Jake never needed me to be a superhero. He just needed me to be honest. To share. And most of all, he needed me to let him grow by allowing him to take care of the person who once raised him. I used to think that if I showed weakness, my son would worry. But it turns out my silence is what made him quietly carry the burden on my behalf. I was wrong to believe love only flows one way. The truth is, lasting love only exists when both sides can be fully themselves, with both their strengths and their vulnerabilities. And I realized something else, too. Money isn't just a number. It's a way to express care, responsibility, and gratitude. Jake didn't just repay that debt with money, he repaid it with the trust one once planted, the perseverance I once taught him, and the quiet resilience I once lived. In that moment, I let go of the invisible burden I had been carrying for years. Not because I had nothing left to worry about, but because I finally accepted that I deserved to receive, too. I took a deep breath and listened to the birdsong of early spring. For the first time in years, I allowed myself to relax. And for the first time in years, I smiled a light, unburdened smile, free of guilt, free of pretense, simply because I had come to understand. Being loved isn't weakness. It's a mature kind of strength. 3 days after that conversation with Jake, I wrote him a letter. Not an email, not a text. A real letter. I wanted him to feel the texture of the paper, to see his mother's handwriting, something more real than any words spoken over the phone. In the letter, I said thank you. Not just for the money, but for the love he's shown me and the patience he's held on to all these years. I also apologized for not being honest, for not sharing, and for not allowing myself to be vulnerable in front of him. I ended the letter with a single line. From now on, I'll let you into my life, including the messy parts. And I meant it. I began telling Jake everything I used to keep hidden, the fears after David died, the nights I had to choose between paying the electric bill or buying cold medicine, even the weeks I survived on white bread and peanut butter just to save a few dollars. I also started changing how I lived. I stopped working 2 shifts a day at the local library, a job I used to think was the only place I still had value. Instead, I signed up for an art class at the community center. Not to become a painter, but to finally live a part of life I had never allowed myself to explore. I sat down with a financial advisor to rebuild my retirement plan. No more fear. No more avoidance. I wanted to live the rest of my years as an independent woman, only this time, knowing I wasn't alone. Every Sunday, I FaceTime with Jake. Not to check up on him, but to truly talk about life, about work, new books, and even the lasagna he's learning to make. One time, I joked, "Looks like I owe you for life now." Jake laughed. "Then don't pay it back. Just let it be emotional equity." I knew then I had changed, not just because the debt was gone, but because I had learned how to live honestly, with myself, with my son, and with life. A few months later, I didn't just feel lighter. I began to notice real, positive changes in my life. First, at the library. I cut back my hours and started teaching part-time as an art instructor for seniors at the community center. At first, I didn't think many people would show up. But I was wrong. The class was full, and the students were enthusiastic, silver-haired women, retired couples. They didn't just want to paint. They wanted to share their stories. And I could be the one who listened. One day, Doris, an older student, looked at me and said, "Lynn, you have no idea, but watching you start to paint made me believe I could start again too. I gave up on my dream of painting when I was 30, but you made me remember it." Her words struck a chord. It was the first time I felt that not only had I changed, but I could also inspire others. That feeling didn't come from money or work, it came from allowing myself to live truthfully. As I began sharing more of my own story with my students, I realized something important. Everyone carries fears and fights their own battles. And when we share, we don't just heal ourselves, we help each other stand stronger. From that day on, my life was different. I no longer felt fear when I looked at my bank account. I no longer lived in stress, hiding my worries or pretending to be fine. I learned how to communicate, how to connect, not just with Jake, but with those around me. Financially, I started investing again, not big, but enough to build a small cushion for the future. Jake no longer worries about me. He still checks in on my finances now and then, but our conversations are no longer just about money. Instead, we talk about what makes us happy. And I realized what I got back wasn't just the money I owed. What I got back was something far more precious, peace of mind, and a love that no longer needed to hide. A year later, my life had changed in ways I never expected. The small decisions I'd made, simple as they seemed, had become the foundation of something solid and lasting. For example, the art class I taught at the community center had grown into a larger group, drawing people of all ages. Students weren't just learning how to paint, they were connecting, sharing their life stories. I wasn't just teaching them how to create art, I was showing them how to see and love themselves again. What I didn't expect was that, in helping others rediscover themselves, I began to rediscover me. Through those art sessions, through those vulnerable conversations about life, I found space to grow. Financially, I'd learned some powerful lessons. After restructuring my savings and investments, I realized I could build financial stability without working myself to the bone. Jake and I now talk about the future with calm and confidence. He no longer carries the same concern for me, and we've even begun planning for my retirement together. Even though the old debt was paid. After paying off the debt, I continued to maintain the habit of saving and investing for the long run. But the biggest change was that I found myself again. I no longer felt trapped by the choices of my past. I had started building a new life, a life I could truly love, one where I no longer had to carry the burden alone. I knew now that I could embrace change, accept help when I needed it, and live with grace and dignity in the choices I made. And more importantly, I realized that it's never too late to change. No matter how many years have gone by, I could still start over, still find joy and new happiness. My life wasn't just made up of hard moments, it was also full of opportunities to grow, to learn, and to live fully. These changes didn't just bring short-term results. They began to reshape how I saw myself, my family, and my life. And I know this journey will continue, with new lessons, new decisions, and a quiet resilience I never knew I had. 12 months after I chose to change, I stood on my balcony, looking out at the garden bathed in sunlight. The trees had grown green again, spring flowers were in full bloom, and the air was as fresh as my life now felt. What lay ahead of me wasn't fear or exhaustion from work or debt. It was peace, a kind of peace I had never known before. My job had changed. The painting class was no longer just a joy, it had become a small source of steady income. I no longer felt pressure to work long hours just to get by. Instead, I had time to enjoy the little things like walks in the park, joining community events, and most of all, spending quality time with Jake. Jake was no longer the son who worried about my future. He saw his mother at peace, content, no longer burdened by financial decisions. We made plans together for the years ahead, and I felt confident about a future free from the weight of debt. Last weekend, Jake and I sat in the garden, sipping coffee and talking about the plans we had for the months to come. I looked into my son's eyes and realized something important. It wasn't just that I had paid off the $250,000 debt. I had returned to myself, the life I was always meant to live. That was the lesson I wanted to pass on to my son, that life isn't always about financial stress or endless responsibility. Sometimes, the way forward is to be brave enough to change, to trust in yourself and the people around you. And more than anything, love isn't a debt to be paid back. Love is acceptance, trust, and care, often expressed through the smallest acts from the heart. As I looked back on my journey, I reminded myself, I hadn't just changed my life. I had changed how I saw life. And in that journey, I discovered something far more valuable than money, inner peace. This story doesn't end with a debt repaid. It ends with the rebirth of a woman who learned how to live truthfully with herself, with her son, and with the world around her. A woman who built a joyful future not just on money, but on deeper values that truly matter. Looking back, I can't help but feel proud. A year ago, I never imagined my life could look like this. Financial worries and burdens used to weigh me down, and I lived with an invisible fear. But now, I no longer feel stuck in my past decisions. I've changed, and I'm living a life I genuinely love. This new direction isn't just a job or a financial plan, it's how I face the world and face myself. I no longer have to tough it out or hide my worries. Now, I accept myself as an ordinary woman, with failures and successes, with pain and with joy. Through the painting class, I haven't just taught others to paint. I've learned how to rediscover myself with every brushstroke. It's given me a sense of joy and creativity I'd never allowed myself to have before. Each painting is more than art. It's a reflection of my journey. A journey of a woman who dared to change and to love herself again. Jake remains my greatest pride. He's not just my son anymore. He's a true companion, someone I can share everything with, joys, struggles, and dreams. Our relationship is no longer just mother and son. We've built something deeper, a relationship rooted in mutual love and respect. And in the end, the lesson I want to leave with others is this: life doesn't always go according to plan. Sometimes you have to stop and change direction. Change can be the hardest thing, but it's also the most rewarding. Never be afraid of change, because it brings new chances, new connections, and most importantly, a life you truly deserve. Peace doesn't come from controlling everything. It comes from learning to accept what you can't control and finding a way to live with it. For me, this is the time to live authentically, to rebuild, and to embrace the days ahead, not in fear of money or perfection, but with the deep understanding that life's challenges always carry the seeds of growth. This story ends with a sense of wholeness, where Lynn not only paid off her debt, but reclaimed what truly matters: her values, her voice, and her vision for a better life. She didn't just find herself again. She found a new path, one built on hope, healing, and happiness.